The American lieutenant's voice cuts through the humid August air. It's soft, almost gentle. August 17th, 1945. Omori Prison Camp, Tokyo Bay. The war has been over for 2 days. The smell of smoke still hangs over the ruined city. Cicadas drone in the afternoon heat. Dust particles drift through shafts of light, penetrating the damaged roof. Captain Fumiko Nakamura stands at attention, her Imperial Japanese Army uniform faded and stained. Her hands are clasped behind her back, fingers digging into her palms. She's prepared for execution, for violence, for the vengeance she knows her nation would have delivered. Lieutenant Robert Chun, U.S. Army interpreter, stands 3 feet away. He's holding a clipboard, not a weapon. Captain Nakamura, he says, in perfect Japanese, "You must be exhausted. Would you like to sit down?" The words don't make sense. She remains rigid, waiting for the real order, the punishment, the inevitable brutality. "I'm not trying to trick you," Chun continues. "You've been standing for 4 hours. Please, sit." Those words were about to become the first crack in a wall of certainty that had taken decades to build. Within days, everything Fumiko Nakamura believed about defeat, about enemies, about honor and shame, would shatter completely. She'd been taught that capture meant death was preferable, that the enemy, especially the American enemy, would save it. Torture them, humiliate them. That surrender was the ultimate disgrace, and those who fell into enemy hands deserved whatever horrors followed. But Chun is offering her a chair and water, and speaking to her like she's human. Around the compound, similar scenes are unfolding. American forces processing hundreds of Japanese military personnel, men and women, who'd been told their captors would be monsters, who'd been prepared for brutality, who'd internalized 15 years of propaganda about Western barbarism. Instead, they're encountering medics, treating wounds, soldiers sharing rations, officers using polite language, Askin names, offering basic dignity. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. More disorienting than the bombing, more shocking than the surrender announcement. Because violence, they understood. Kindness from the enemy. That didn't exist in their framework of reality. What very few people understood then, what historians are still grappling with now, is that this moment represented something unprecedented in military history. Not just occupation, not just victor and vanquished, but a deliberate, systematic attempt to break cycles of hatred through the simple, revolutionary act of treating defeated enemies as human beings. How did words of basic kindness from American soldiers become more powerful than weapons in reshaping post-war Japan? How did simple dignity offered to defeated military officers cascade into one of the most successful occupations in modern history? How did enemies become partners in rebuilding a nation from literal and psychological ashes? The answer begins not in August 1945, but in the 1920s, when Japanese society began its transformation from emerging democracy to militant empire. When the language of honor became the language of death. To understand Fumiko Nakamura's shock at being offered a chair, we must go back to 1931. The year Japan invaded Manchuria. The year military culture began consuming civilian society. The year honor became weaponized. Fumiko was 9 years old when the invasion happened. She remembers her father, a mid-level bureaucrat, coming home from work, his face grave. "Everything will change now," he told her mother. He was right. Within 2 years, military officers held unprecedented political power. They glorified Bushido, the way of the warrior, but stripped it of its complexity, its emphasis on compassion and wisdom. What remained was a cult of death worship disguised as honor. By 1935, Japanese schools taught children that individual life was meaningless compared to national destiny, that sacrifice for the emperor was the highest purpose, that death in service was transcendent, while survival in defeat was unforgivable shame. Colonel Hideki Yamamoto, an educator who later fled to China, wrote in his memoir, "We didn't teach children to value their lives. We taught them to throw them away. We called it honor. It was indoctrination." Fumiko entered the system as a teenager. Smart, capable, from a respectable family. She joined the Women's Army Corps in 1938, age 16. Not because she was conscripted, women weren't drafted, but because the alternative was marriage to a man chosen by a family arrangement or factory work. The military offered education, purpose, escape from traditional constraints. The price was absolute obedience and ideological conformity. She learned that Americans were materialistic devils, racially inferior, culturally degenerate, incapable of sacrifice or honor. They would rape, pillage, destroy. They had no concept of human dignity. Every lecture, every training session, every propaganda film, the message was consistent. The enemy is subhuman. Don't expect mercy. Don't offer it. What Japanese civilians didn't know was that American military planners were studying Japanese culture intensively, not to exploit weaknesses, though that too, but to understand how to break cycles of militarism without destroying the people themselves. The U.S. War Department established the Civil Affairs Staging Area in 1944, training thousands of officers in Japanese language, culture, psychology, teaching them that Japan's militarism was recent imposed from above, not intrinsic to Japanese character. These officers learned that Japanese civilians had been indoctrinated to fear capture worse than death. That propaganda had convinced them, Americans were that the first interactions after surrender would be critical in determining whether occupation would succeed or ignite eternal resistance. Lieutenant Robert Chun was one of these officers. Chinese American, Berkeley educated, fluent in Japanese. He'd spent 6 months learning not just language but cultural nuance, how to show respect without showing weakness, how to offer dignity without dishonoring the system that demanded obedience. He understood something profound. You can't occupy a nation successfully through force alone. You need to give people reason to accept the occupation, to participate in reconstruction, to believe that defeat doesn't mean annihilation. This wasn't just about military strategy. It was about psychological warfare of a completely different kind, warfare against the propaganda that had turned ordinary people into fanatics. The powder keg moment came on August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement, his voice broadcast on Radotha, first time most Japanese had heard their living god speak. His words were formal, archaic, deliberately obscure. Many listeners didn't initially understand he was announcing surrender. The word surrender wasn't even used. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. Fumiko heard the broadcast in a military communications office in Tokyo. She understood immediately. The war was over. Japan had lost. Around her, officers wept. Some spoke of suicide. The shame was incomprehensible. Everything they'd sacrificed for meaningless. Everything they'd been promised lies. The destiny they'd believed inevitable shattered. She felt numb. Not grief, not rage. Just absence, like reality itself had been revoked. And then, on August 17th, American forces arrived at her facility to process personnel and assume control. Fumiko stands in the processing line. 200 military personnel, officers and enlisted. Men and women, all waiting to discover their fate. They expect summary execution, torture, sexual violence. That's what they've been taught to expect. That's what Japanese forces had inflicted on conquered peoples across Asia. Surely the Americans would reciprocate. The line moves slowly. People ahead disappear into a building. No screams, no gunshots, just silence. The silence is more terrifying than violence would be. Fumiko's turn. She enters the building. Lieutenant Chun sits behind a table. He stands when she enters, offers the chair across from him. She remains standing, rigid. Terror, masked as discipline. Fumiko had been taught that Americans would treat Japanese women as spoils of war, that female military personnel would be particular targets, that rape was inevitable, death preferable. Now, this American officer was offering her a chair, speaking politely, asking her name with respect in his tone. She gives her name, rank, serial number, nothing more. That's the protocol. Name, rank, serial number. Prepare for death. Chun writes on his clipboard, 10 Lukes up! Captain Nakamura, you must be exhausted. Would you like water? Something to eat? The question breaks her, not violently. Quietly, like ice cracking on a frozen pond. The sound nobody else can hear but you feel in your bones. She'd been taught that strength meant refusing comfort, that accepting kindness from the enemy was collaboration. That honor required silent suffering, but she hasn't eaten since yesterday. She's been standing for hours. Her commanding officers have disappeared, fled, or suicided, or arrested. She doesn't know which. She's 23 years old. She's terrified. And this enemy soldier is offering her water. Yes, she whispers. The word feels like betrayal, like surrender on a deeper level than military defeat, like acknowledging her own humanity when she'd been trained to transcend it. Chun calls for someone. A Japanese civilian aide brings water and rice, sets it in front of her. The aide's hands don't shake. She's not afraid of these Americans. That's somehow more shocking than anything else. Fumiko drinks. The water is clean, cold, not poisoned. Not a trick. We're going to ask you some questions, Chun says. About your duties, your unit. Nothing classified, we know. The war is over. We just need accurate records for repatriation. Repatriation, the word lands like a bomb. He's talking about sending her home. Not execution, not imprisonment. Home. They expected massacre. They found bureaucracy. They expected revenge. They found administration. They had been told Americans were savages who would desecrate the defeated. The truth was Americans were soldiers following protocols that prioritized human dignity. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Hiroshima, everywhere American forces took control, similar scenes played out. Japanese military and civilian prisoners encountering unexpected treatment. Not perfect treatment, not without racism or cruelty in individual cases, but systemically, officially, the policy was clear. Treat the defeated with basic human dignity. Feed them. Give medical care. Process them efficiently. Send them home when possible. For people who'd been taught that defeat meant obliteration, this was incomprehensible. More than incomprehensible, reality shattering. And that shattering, that fundamental disruption of propaganda, would become the foundation for everything that followed. For Japan's transformation, for the success of occupation, for the possibility of former enemies becoming allies. But first, thousands of Japanese military personnel like Fumiko Nakamura had to process what it meant when the monsters you'd even taught to fear turned out to be humans who saw you as human too. The infrastructure behind these encounters was vast and carefully designed. The U.S. military government had prepared for this moment with unprecedented thoroughness, while Japanese military leadership had expected invasion and fought to the last man. American planners had prepared for occupation and rebuilding from day one. They understood something the Japanese high command hadn't. The actual war was winnable through military force. The peace required something else entirely. The military government handbook for Japan ran 387 pages. It covered everything from food distribution to education reform. But the first section, the longest section, focused on civil affairs and population management, how to interact with defeated Japanese people in ways that didn't perpetuate cycles of hatred. They had psychological operations teams, cultural advisors, linguists, former missionaries who knew Japan intimately, Japanese-American soldiers who could navigate cultural complexity, and most critically, explicit orders that brutality would not be tolerated. General Douglas MacArthur, whatever his flaws, understood that occupying Japan successfully required winning hearts and minds, not just controlling territory. His first proclamation emphasized that Americans came as liberators from militarism, not as conquerors of the Japanese people. The scale was staggering. By September 1945, the U.S. military was processing 50,000 Japanese prisoners. Daily, they needed 10,000 interpreters. They had 3,000 medical personnel treating Japanese wounded. They distributed 2 million rations per day to starving civilians. the equivalent of rebuilding a nation while simultaneously dismantling its military infrastructure, and doing it while treating the people you'd just fought with basic human decency. The individuals implementing this system became faces of the occupation. Lieutenant Chun was one of thousands, but his story illustrates the larger truth. Chun's parents had immigrated from China to California in 1910. He'd grown up experiencing American racism firsthand. Internment fears during the war, discrimination despite his citizenship. He had every reason to hate, to see Japanese as enemies who'd ravaged his ancestral homeland. Instead, he saw them as people trapped in a system that had consumed them. He treated Fumiko Nakamura with dignity not because she deserved it necessarily, but because that's what separated democracy from tyranny, the recognition of universal human worth. What seemed like individual acts of kindness was actually a coordinated policy by people who understood that Yuko unbuild democracy on humiliation, that former enemies become allies only when treated as potential partners, not permanent subordinates. The system had weak points. MacArthur's approach was paternalistic. The occupation involved cultural imperialism. Economic policies benefited American interests, and individual atrocities by American soldiers occurred despite official policy. But, compared to what Japanese civilians and military personnel expected compared to how Japan had treated conquered peoples, the reality was shocking in its relative restraint. Most surprising were the Japanese civilians who became intermediaries. People like Shigeru Yoshida, who'd opposed militarism quietly during the war, now openly collaborated with occupation forces. Not as traitors, but as patriots who believed Japan's future required cooperation with former enemies. These civilians saw what military officers like. Fumiko initially Kuronta. That American occupation offered possibilities Japanese militarism had destroyed. Freedom of speech, democratic reforms, women's rights, land redistribution, all the things that military government had suppressed. The occupation wasn't imposing democracy on unwilling subjects. It was creating space for Japanese reformers to implement changes they wanted for decades but couldn't achieve under military dictatorship. In the third week of September 1945, Fumiko faces her impossible choice. She's been assigned to work with occupation administration, translating documents, and helping coordinate the return of displaced Japanese civilians. She can refuse, claim the shame is too great, that working for former enemies dishonors everything she fought for. That's what her training demands, what her fellow officers expect. But she's seen things now that can't be unseen. American medics treating Japanese wounded with the same care they give their own. Engineers repairing infrastructure in Japanese neighborhoods before their own barracks. Officers speaking to Japanese civilians with respect, not contempt. The choice isn't really between honor and dishonor. It's between clinging to propaganda that shaped her youth or accepting reality that contradicts everything she was taught. She chooses reality, accepts the position, becomes part of the occupation apparatus. The shame is profound. Fellow officers who are being repatriated look at her with contempt. Collaborator traitor. Weak. She sees it in their eyes. But she also sees something else. They're being sent home to a devastated country. 2 cities destroyed by firebombing, to an economy in ruins, to a population traumatized and broken. She's being given opportunity to help rebuild, not as conqueror, but as participant. The distinction matters. Chun becomes something like a mentor, not quite a friend. The power differential and cultural distance prevent that, but an ally of sorts. He teaches her how Americans think, how democracy functions, why individual rights matter. She challenges him, questions the occupation's legitimacy, points out American hypocrisy, claiming to bring democracy while governing without Japanese consent. He doesn't shut her down, doesn't punish her for speaking directly. Instead engages, admits the contradictions, explains that imperfect democracy is better than efficient tyranny. These conversations are revolutionary. Not because of what's said, but because they happen at all. An American officer and a Japanese officer, formerly enemies, having genuine dialogue about complex political questions. 6 months ago, Fumiko had known exactly who she was. Imperial subject. Military officer. Someone whose individual thoughts were subordinate to national destiny. Someone who would die before questioning authority. Now, she couldn't imagine going back to that certainty. To that comfortable subordination. June had given her something more dangerous than weapons. The habit of critical thought. The expectation that her opinions mattered. The recognition that blind obedience enables atrocity. But this knowledge came with its price. Once you can see the system that shaped you, you can never be shaped by it the same way again. Once you've experienced being treated as autonomous individual rather than imperial subject, subordination feels like suffocation. Her family, when she finally contacts them, doesn't understand her transformation. Her father speaks of shame. Her mother weeps. They'd rather she had died honorably than lived in collaboration. She tries to explain, the Americans aren't what they'd been told. The occupation isn't what they'd feared. Japan can rebuild, but only if enough people choose to participate rather than resist. They don't want to hear it. The propaganda ran too deep. The defeat was too profound. The shame too overwhelming. But Fumiko has crossed a threshold she can't uncross. She's become a person who asks why, who questions, who thinks for herself. The occupation gave her that, and nobody, not her family, not her former comrades, not even her own doubts can take it away. This transformation wasn't unique to Fumiko. Across Japan, thousands of former military personnel were experiencing similar reckonings. The pattern was consistent. Initial fear, then confusion, then gradual realization that the enemy they'd been taught to hate were humans capable of decency. In Osaka, former Army nurse Keiko Suzuki volunteered with American medical teams treating Japanese civilians. She expected harassment. Instead, found American nurses sharing techniques, offering antibiotics that Japanese military had withheld from civilians, treating patients with care regardless of nationality. She wrote in her diary, I spent 5 years in military hospitals being taught that only Japanese lives had dignity. In 3 weeks with American nurses, I learned that suffering is universal and care should be too. My entire career feels like it was built on lies. The revelation wasn't just about Americans, it was about herself. About what she'd accepted, what she'd been complicit in, what she'd failed to question when questioning might have made a difference. Not everyone embraced this change. In Kyoto, a group of former officers organized resistance to occupation reforms, called for renewed militarism, tried to assassinate collaborators like Fumiko, who worked with Americans. Their attempt failed, but their existence revealed important truth. Propaganda doesn't die just because reality contradicts it. Some people would rather cling to comforting lies than confront uncomfortable truths. For Tomoko Ishida, former communications officer stationed in Manila, the price was even steeper. She returned to Japan in late 1945, having seen what Japanese occupation did to Philippines. The brutality, the atrocities, the casual cruelty that she'd witnessed but hadn't stopped. Now, seeing American occupation of Japan conducted with restraint she'd never seen Japanese forces show. The contrast was devastating. Not just recognition that she'd been lied to, recognition that she'd been part of something monstrous and had lacked the courage to resist. Her guilt was crushing. She tried to tell her story to Warno Terrace, to explain that the honor they'd believed in was lie built on corpses of innocence. Nobody wanted to hear it. Japan was busy rebuilding, moving forward, forgetting. The uncomfortable truths were buried under economic recovery and political reconstruction. Tomoko never recovered. She died by suicide in 1948. Her last letter explained, I go you and leave knowing what I helped enable. I can move forward when the nation refuses to look back. The Americans showed us mercy we didn't deserve. But mercy is harder to bear than punishment would have been. This was the hidden cost of kind occupation. People who'd been prepared for brutality could process it. But kindness in the face of their own brutality forced confrontation with moral reality they were unprepared for. Some couldn't bear it. By early 1946, the occupation had established new patterns. Japanese women's rights expanded dramatically. Education reformed to emphasize critical thinking over indoctrination. Land redistribution gave peasants ownership. Democratic institutions were forming, but not everyone welcomed these changes. traditional power structures, aristocratic families, Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates. Conservative politicians saw occupation reforms as threats to their authority. They couldn't oppose openly. MacArthur controlled everything, but they worked behind scenes. Slowing reforms, protecting assets, maintaining informal power networks that would survive occupation. Their resistance was sophisticated. They didn't reject democracy outright. They embraced it performatively while ensuring that actual power remained in familiar hands. They appointed figureheads while real decisions happened in private meetings Americans couldn't access. The opposition claimed they were protecting Japanese culture from American cultural imperialism. There was truth to this. The occupation did impose American values, did dismiss Japanese traditions, did assume Western superiority. But the opposition wasn't defending culture. They were defending privilege. The traditional hierarchy had benefited them enormously. Democratic reforms threatened that. Fumiko saw this clearly. Working in administration, she watched conservative politicians manipulate the system, saw how they paid lip service to reform while maintaining old power structures. She reported some of it to Chun. He listened, but couldn't always act. The occupation needed Japanese cooperation. Pushing too hard would create backlash. They had to accept compromises that allowed old elites to maintain some influence. This isn't perfect, Chun admitted to her. Democracy never is, but it's better than what you had. And once people experience freedom, it's hard to take it away completely. He was right, but frustrating, because Fumiko had believed the propaganda about American democracy. Now she was learning democracy was messy, compromised, often corrupt. Still better than military dictatorship, but not the shining ideal she'd been taught to expect. The moment came in April 1946 when the new Japanese Constitution was promulgated, written primarily by Americans, but presented as Japanese initiative. It included women's suffrage, land reform, pacifist military restrictions, and guaranteed civil liberties. Conservative Japanese politicians called it humiliation, foreign imposition, un-Japanese. But Japanese women flooded polling stations in the first democratic election. Workers joined unions suddenly allowed to organize. Students protested in ways that would have gotten them imprisoned years before. The Constitution wasn't perfect, but it created space for people to imagine Japan differently, to claim rights they'd never had, to become citizens rather than subjects. For Fumiko, watching Japanese women vote for first time, the victory was bittersweet. Yes, democracy was emerging. Yes, reforms were taking hold. But at what cost? Japan had been burned to ashes. Hundreds of thousands dead. 2 cities atomically destroyed. A generation traumatized, and the reforms came not from within, but imposed from without. Could they have found this path without the war? Without the devastation? She'd never know. But the question haunted her. The climax of Fumiko's personal journey comes in August 1946, exactly 1 year after surrender. She has been asked to speak at a ceremony honoring Japanese-American soldiers who fought in Europe while their families were in. The irony is profound. Japanese Americans proving loyalty to America by fighting while Japanese in Japan fought America. She doesn't want to speak. She's not ready to articulate what she's learned, not ready to confront the contradictions in front of an audience. Chun encourages her. People need to hear your perspective. You're living proof that enemies can become partners. The ceremony is small. A few dozen attendees, American officials, Japanese civilians, former military personnel. The divide is still visible, still raw. And then Fumiko sees something that changes everything. Among the honored soldiers, Lieutenant Chun's cousin, Anissa, who'd fought with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Wounded in Italy, returned to find his parents' business destroyed by internment. Chun hasn't mentioned this, hasn't spoken about his family's suffering. He has treated Fumiko with dignity, despite having every reason for hatred not just against Japan but against America too. She understands suddenly. This isn't about nations. It's about choices individuals make, despite systems that demand hatred. Chun chose to see her as human despite propaganda. She's learning to see Americans as human despite indoctrination. That's what breaks cycles. Not governments, not policies. Individual humans choosing to act with decency even when the systems around them encourage cruelty. She gives her speech. It's halting, emotional, honest. She speaks about propaganda, about how Israeli people believe lies about enemies, about how surprised she was by American kindness, about how difficult it is to accept that everything you believed was wrong. Some attendees walk out. The truth is too uncomfortable, but others stay. Listen. Cry. What no one had known was that Chun himself had requested this assignment. He'd volunteered for occupation duty, specifically because he wanted to break cycles of hatred. His parents had taught him that Chinese and Japanese people weren't natural enemies. They'd been made enemies by governments and circumstances. He'd taken that lesson and applied it to American-Japanese relations, believed that treating former enemies with dignity would create possibilities for lasting peace. He reveals this in conversation with Fumiko after the ceremony, explains that his choice wasn't naive idealism. He was pragmatic, peace-building. Because hatred perpetuates itself unless someone chooses to stop perpetuating it. You can't control what your government did, he tells her. You can only control how you respond now. Same for me. Same for everyone. The immediate aftermath of this revelation spreads through the occupation community. Fumiko's speech gets reprinted in Japanese newspapers. Some praise her courage, others denounce her as traitor. But something has shifted. More Japanese civilians start engaging with occupation authorities, seeing them as humans rather than faceless conquerors. The policy of treating defeated enemies with dignity is working, not because Americans are saints there, not but because dignity is contagious. For Fumiko, the victory is bittersweet. She's found purpose in rebuilding, found community among unlikely allies, but she carries guilt that will never fully resolve. Guilt about what she supported during the war. What she failed to question, who she was before she learned to think critically. The Americans offered mercy. That mercy created space for transformation. But transformation requires confronting uncomfortable truths about who you were. That confrontation never stops hurting. In the years following 1946, the occupation's impact becomes clearer. Japan's democratic institutions take root deeper than anyone expected. Women's participation in politics grows. Labor movements organize. Education emphasizes critical thinking. The economic recovery is remarkable. By 1950, Japanese industrial production has recovered to pre-war levels. By 1955, it exceeds them. The nation that was bombed into rubble becomes economic powerhouse. Remember Fumicho Nakamura, who stood rigid expecting execution in August 1945. 20 years later, in 1965, she would be Deputy Director of International Relations for Japan's Ministry of Education. She'd visit America multiple times, speak at conferences about post-war reconciliation, help design cultural exchange programs. Her memoir, published in 1968, was titled From Enemies to Friends: One Woman's Journey Through Defeat. It documented her transformation from military officer expecting death to diplomat building bridges between former enemies. The dedication to Lieutenant Chun, who taught me that kindness is stronger than propaganda, and to all who choose humanity over hatred, even when systems demand otherwise. What seemed like small acts of decency, offering chairs, speaking respectfully, treating prisoners humanely, would eventually reshape an entire society. Those acts didn't erase atrocities, didn't eliminate valid criticisms of occupation, but they created possibility for transformation that brutality never could. The real heirs of this change were subsequent generations. Japanese born in the 1950s grew up in democracy. They couldn't imagine their grandparents' militarism, couldn't comprehend propaganda that convinced millions that death was preferable to defeat. They took for granted freedoms that had been unthinkable before occupation. They built relationships with America that, while imperfect and unequal, were partnerships rather than master-servant dynamics. This generation would create modern Japan, would navigate complex relationship with war memory, would struggle with how to honor ancestors while acknowledging their complicity in atrocities. The cost was permanent, historical reckoning. Japan could never forget the war. The occupation ensured that American presence military bases that remain today as constant reminder of defeat and subsequent transformation. Today, Japan is America's strongest Pacific ally. The relationship is complex, often fraught, still marked by power imbalances, but it's also functional, productive, built on shared interests, if not shared history. That alliance exists because the occupation, for all its flaws, chose dignity over revenge, chose to treat defeated enemies as humans capable of transformation rather than irredeemable monsters deserving only punishment. The connection to present day is urgent. In an era of rising nationalism, of leaders who demonize enemies, of movements that dehumanize others, Japan's story reminds us that cycles of hatred can be broken. Not easily, not perfectly, but genuinely. It requires choosing to see humanity in those you've been taught to hate. Requires offering dignity even to those who don't seem to deserve it. Requires believing that people can change when given reason to change. The alternative is endless cycles of revenge. Eternal enemies. Permanent conflict. The occupation wasn't perfect, but it demonstrated that a different path is possible. Fumiko Nakamura died in 2004, age 82. Among her possessions, letters from Chun, spanning 40 years. They'd maintained friendship long after occupation ended, visited each other's countries, watched their children become friends. Also, her old military uniform. She'd kept it, not out of pride, out of reminder of who she'd been, what she'd believed. How completely someone's worldview can transform when propaganda meets reality. In her final recorded interview, she was asked, "What do you want people to understand about that first encounter with Lieutenant Chun?" She thought carefully before answering. "He gave me something more powerful than weapons or punishment. He gave me cognitive dissonance. The space between what I'd been taught to expect and what actually happened. That space is where change becomes possible. That space is where transformation begins." She continued, "I expected a monster. I found a man. That simple collision between propaganda and reality, that's what saved me. Saved Japan, really. Because you can't sustain hatred against someone who insists on treating you with dignity." The lesson wasn't just that America conducted a successful occupation. It was deeper. Dehumanization requires distance. Propaganda requires abstractions. But when you sit across from someone who sees you as human, who speaks to you with basic decency, the abstractions collapse. You can't sustain propaganda against lived experience. You can't maintain hatred against someone who offers kindness. The contradictions become unbearable, and transformation becomes necessary. This wasn't just about Japan recovering from war. It was about humanity learning, however imperfectly, however temporarily, that the most powerful weapon against cycles of hatred is in violence. It's the consistent, stubborn, often frustrating choice to treat those you could destroy with the dignity they'd deny themselves. The former Omori prison camp still exists. It's been converted into a peace museum. The room where Fumiko first met Chun has been preserved. Simple. 2 chairs. Table. On the wall, a plaque in Japanese and English. Here, an enemy offered kindness. Here, propaganda met reality. Here, transformation became possible. May we remember that peace begins not with governments or policies, but with individual humans choosing to see each other as human. That simple room, those unexpected words, that choice to offer dignity instead of revenge. A small moment in vast history, but small moments of human decency accumulate into movements, into transformations, into nations rebuilt on principles rather than ruins. Lieutenant Robert Chun offered Captain Fumiko Nakamura a chair and some water. What he really offered was an alternative to eternal hatred, the choice to see former enemies as future partners, the possibility that people can change. When given reason to believe change is possible. And once you've been offered that possibility, once you've experienced being treated as human by someone you were taught to hate, you can never fully accept dehumanization again. Not of yourself, not of orders. That's what broke the cycle. Not military superiority, not occupation policy, but thousands of small moments where individual humans chose decency over revenge, dignity over destruction, possibility over punishment. Kindness, it turns out, is revolutionary. Not because it erases history, but because it creates space for different futures.